So we want to continue with the treatment that we began in Tuesday's class session, although you'll recall that a substantial chunk of that class meeting was taken by watching some segments from a feature film called Europa, Europe. I think everybody who's in here today was also in here on Tuesday, so you remember what I'm talking about. Somebody had asked me after the class session that, something about trying to reconstruct the question. Basically, did the Nazis really sort of believe? Do you remember the scene, that last scene where we watched, where the teacher is taking the measurements and trying to reach some conclusions about racial identity based on those measurements? Somebody asked me, did the Nazis really believe that they could use that was a scientific approach to making those determinations? And the quick answer to that question is yes, but I also pointed out to the person who asked the question that it certainly wasn't new with the Nazis. Okay, thought I'd take just a minute here before we get back on track with where we left off last time to just sort of share some information with you. This may be something that you're already familiar with, maybe not. I don't know what kind of things you read or what kind of information you've been exposed to in other classes that you've taken, but I've indicated here that as far back as the 1830s, 1840s, we could see that there was some debate within the scientific community about this sort of thing. The American scientist Samuel Morton conducted an experiment in which he had some skulls from specimens that he categorized in one of 5 categories: Ethiopian, Caucasian. These are his categories, not mine. Okay, Ethiopian, Native American, Caucasian, Malay, and Mongolian. Okay, and he filled those skulls with white pepper seeds and concluded, based on the volume of pepper seeds that he could put into the cranial cavity of these specimens, that the white Caucasian skulls held more pepper seeds, and therefore they were bigger, had a bigger capacity, and therefore whites had bigger brains and therefore were smarter. And you can see up there on the screen that he concluded that the Africans had the smallest skull size and therefore the lowest intelligence. What we discovered some years later, what researchers discovered some years later, was that Morton his methodology was corrupted, because even if that would be a valid way of doing it in the first place, and certainly reaching those conclusions, whether those conclusions would be valid, but his practice was to take the specimens where he's putting pepper seeds in, and sort of pack them in, right, to the specimens that he had identified as Caucasian, and then just put sort of loose pepper seeds in the other, to varying degrees, in the other specimens. So that, he was essentially ensuring in his methodology that he was going to be able to put more pepper seeds in the specimens that we presume that he wanted to, demonstrate that conclusion he had apparently ahead of time was valid, right? But just, if you think, okay, way back in the 1830s, maybe the scientific method was not, it was more suspect or whatever. Notice that at the very same time, or, contemporaneous to Morton's work, you have the German scientist Friedrich Tiedemann, who concluded that the contemporary European belief that Africans have smaller brains and are thus intellectually inferior is scientifically unfounded and based purely on prejudice. So as far back as the 1830s, the 1840s, you have, individuals in the scientific community who can recognize that there are these biases built in for some people in their research methodology. Just like what you were seeing on this, feature film with, the conclusions that they were reaching about, measuring the size of the head and the distances and all that sort of stuff. How many of you are familiar with a social philosophy known as social Darwinism? Who's heard of that before? A couple of people, 3 or 4 people? Good. So social Darwinism was a phenomenon of the late 1800s into the very early part of the 20th century. It is associated principally with the British philosopher Herbert Spencer and the British economist Walter Bagehot, but also the American sociologist and economist William Graham Sumner, who was also a Presbyterian minister, I believe, and American industrialists such as Andrew Carnegie, John Rockefeller, and others, Jay Gould and others who were prominent social Darwinists of that period. And basically what they were trying to do was apply Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection to human society, okay? Now, I'm not a evolutionary biologist. I have very little, education or training in the biological sciences, but I think maybe enough to know that this concept of the survival of the fittest is really not associated with Charles Darwin himself. To my knowledge, Charles Darwin never wrote about the survival of the fittest. He never even used that terminology. Darwin's theory of natural selection was an attempt to explain that the species that are the most adaptable, right, are the ones that survive or thrive. So the social Darwinists essentially pervert that theory of natural selection in an effort to apply it to human society. And this idea of survival of the fittest is really associated with the social Darwinists rather than Charles Darwin himself. But the idea is that individuals and groups of individuals along racial or ethnic lines achieve success or dominance because of inherent genetic superiority and a resulting competitive advantage. Right? The social Darwinists argued that the individuals in society and the groups of individuals in society who are most successful are demonstrating themselves to be the most fit members of society, and those that are not successful materially, right, are demonstrating themselves to be the least fit members of society. Now, one of the most pernicious aspects of social Darwinist theory was a very strong opposition to any sort of social programs, to poverty relief programs, etc., undertaken by government, because the social Darwinists essentially were arguing that promoted an artificial selection rather than a natural selection. Right? The reason that we have poverty and the reason that we have people who demonstrate themselves to be less successful is because nature is nature is essentially trying to weed those people out. Okay? So that's the late 1800s, about the Gilded Age. Have you all remember learning about the Gilded Age in your American history course? So the industrial period and leading up to the 20th century, and as I said, maybe even into the early part of the 20th century. And then I've indicated as the last item here that you have, and again, we're talking about, this is before the Nazis in Germany, right? You have the Eugenics Movement. How many of you have heard of the Eugenics Movement? Okay, this is an American phenomenon. It's not exclusively American, but it certainly was very pronounced in the United States. The zoologist Charles Davenport, plant geneticist Edward East, geneticist and Nobel Prize laureate Herman Muller, U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, Secretary of State Elihu Root, and Associate Justice of the Supreme Court John Marshall Harlan were all ascribed to, in some degree or another, to the ideas of the eugenics movement. And there's a lot we could say about this, as with everything that we introduce in this course, but just to keep it as simple as possible, I think the best way to think about the eugenics movement is that there are really 2 different strands of the eugenics movement. So the first that I've listed here is positive eugenics. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Let me put that on the screen. Bear with me here for just a second. That's what you're trying to alert me to, right?
Yes, sir. I'm sorry. I meant to do that earlier because I believe we online we missed some stuff here.
Okay, yeah, I apologize. Sometimes I just forget that little step to put that on the screen, but you can see it now, right?
Yes, sir, and I completely understand.
Okay. Now, it's not going to be up there much longer, so you may have to go back and look at the recorded version, the early part of the recorded version of this class session in order to pick up any details that you want to pick up. Okay?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. So as I was saying, there's the positive eugenics, which focused on the proliferation of, quote, a good stock, advocating improving the human species through control of hereditary factors and mating. And then the negative eugenics, which I think has a much more, not that there aren't serious problems with the positive eugenics notions, but much more invidious aspects of the negative eugenics, which called for the elimination of bad stock, including policies that would that promoted sterilization of the poor, infirmed, physically disabled, and persons of lesser intellect and poor moral character. Right? So again, some of you have said you've heard of this, so you're not surprised. Okay, others, if you haven't heard of this, maybe you're surprised that this is a part of our history, and really only about 100 years ago. And again, my point, just to sort of wrap this part of it up so we can move on, get back on track, is that it's the kind of things that you saw in that feature film yesterday that we associate closely with the Nazis, this use of science to promote, racial purity, it's certainly not original to the Nazis. And we even have had historically a healthy dose of that in American society as well. Right? Okay. Questions about that? Well, I think where we left off, we had suggested that, one of the things that we saw in the segments from the feature film were these deliberate orchestrated efforts on the part of both the communists in Russia and the Nazis in Germany to manipulate or propagate values in support of the regime. And I asked you whether that was something that was only characteristic of authoritarian systems, or do we see it at least to some degree in democratic systems as well? And as I recall, the consensus was that if it's nothing other than having kids recite the Pledge of Allegiance, that's an effort to instill loyalty, to build loyalty and support for the system. But there are probably other things that we can point to as well. Okay? Then we moved to, I think this is kind of where we left off. I had suggested to you that most political scientists, I think the overwhelming majority of political scientists, would agree with the assertion. This is an axiomatic statement, right? It's just sort of almost universally accepted among political scientists that diffuse support is critical to the long-term maintenance and stability of the political system. Now, who remembers what we were distinguishing diffuse support from? That word diffuse, as it's used in the context of that sentence up there, that first sentence, is an adjective, right? And you know what adjectives do, as in the English language or any language, what do adjectives do, right? They describe or modify, right? But by implication, we can conclude that, well, it must mean what? That the noun is support, right? So if we're identifying something called diffuse support, put that word diffuse in front of it, we go click, click, click. Oh, that there must mean that there's some other kind of support, right? So what did we say last time the other type of support is? That we political scientists, people in my profession, like to talk about and write about? Well, nobody remembers. If you don't remember, just kind of reason it out. Specific support, that's all. I'm trying to get you to remember these, become more conversant with these terms, right? Because if nothing else, you're going to see them on a quiz next week, or could see them on a quiz next week, right? So we're distinguishing diffuse support from specific support. We're saying that for now at least, what we're interested in is this concept of diffuse support, because it's critical to the maintenance, long-term maintenance and stability of political system. What we're saying is that political systems can't really survive for any indefinite period without it. And then the second assertion that we mentioned was a political system has to have some mechanism to generate that support. Remember, I told you that, this idea of propagating values or manipulating values in support of the regime that we see clearly with the Nazis in Germany and the communists in Russia is an effort to build that support, to build that loyalty for the regime, for the system, okay? So you see that on the list there because it raises the obvious question, well, how do regimes do that, okay? And since we watched the segments from the film first, even though it's third on the list there, we went to that one first because we already had some familiarity with it from watching those segments. But there are several other things here, and I think we started talking about that, right? One probably very obvious mechanism is by consistently satisfying demands and expectations. And that seems intuitively, it makes a lot of sense intuitively, right? If people believe that the system is doing what they think it's supposed to be doing, okay, it's satisfying their expectations and basic demands, then they're much more likely to support the system, right? So that one seems pretty obvious. What seems less obvious, at least first glance, as we were saying last time, is the use of coercion. But as I pointed out to you, that's something that regimes have relied on historically for millennia, right? Since the beginning of human civilization. Regimes have used coercion or force to build that support. If you think about support, strictly as something that people give because they like something, then this one may be a little bit harder for you to accept. But what I'm trying to get you to understand is that, this concept of support that we're talking about here doesn't necessarily mean that people like it. As I said last time, I have a pretty distinct memory of saying, there's something pretty compelling about tanks on the street or soldiers, which is something we don't see in the United States and many other democratic systems. But you've certainly seen the pictures, you've seen the video in one part of the world or another where, that heavy-handed use of force is a principal tactic that regimes use to maintain support, right? Again, the manipulation of values, propaganda, what I would, really want you to think about there is whether that is something that democratic systems use, and we've concluded, at least to some degree, that is true. All right, so the last one is socialization theory. And I've got a big red arrow by that because I'm trying to indicate to you that that's the one that we really want to focus on. And underneath it says systems theory argues that values in support of the political system are transferred through a generational process, wherein the family teaches values that will allow the child to succeed in society. These values are then reinforced by other important agents of socialization. The authors of your textbook, for those of you who have read chapter 6, it is the reading assignment for this week, they have some discussion of the socialization process. I think they use the term agencies of socialization rather than agents of socialization, but we're talking about the same thing, okay? All right, so systems theory is really in competition somewhat with hegemonic theory. Hegemonic theory argues that the principal way that regimes build support for themselves is through a deliberate, orchestrated propaganda campaign. The word hegemony means to assert control, right? So the regime is asserting control or hegemony over the values of the population. It's a very, I don't want to use the word conspiratorial because I don't think it's entirely accurate, but it certainly is an argument that suggests that it's by design, okay? That, the principal way that these values are transferred is by design. Remember, I told you last time that value systems, there's no question that value systems they're certainly not genetically transferred, right? I've never heard of, in the old Soviet Union or in Nazi Germany, a child springing from its mother's uterus and going, Heil Hitler. That didn't happen, right? And in the United States, they don't come out screaming, give me liberty or give me death. Okay? So again, whatever value system it is that we hold is the result of teaching and learning. It's not the result of genetic transmission. It's not a biological trait, right? The only real debate is over how that teaching and learning takes place. Hegemonic theorists say that it is the result of orchestrated efforts, manipulation, propaganda campaigns. That's the principal way that it happens. Systems theorists say, well, there may be some of that, even in democratic systems, but that's not the principal way that it happens. The main way that it happens is through this process of socialization. Okay, everybody with me on that? Okay, and I'm telling you, since I've got the big red arrow here, and I've been drawing your attention to that several times, this is the explanation that we really want to focus on. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the socialization process. Here's a sort of basic definition of socialization. I'm not a sociologist. I am emphatically not a sociologist. My background is in economics. Economists generally and sociologists generally are at to some degree at odds intellectually. Our perspectives, our theoretical perspectives are very different. But I want to give my friends, the sociologists, I want to treat them fairly, okay? So who's taking a sociology course? Okay, a couple of people, all right? I assume just sort of an introductory sociology course. Did you learn about the socialization process in that sociology course? Again, I'm not a sociologist, but my guess would be that that's basically what the course is about. That's essentially what you would think an introductory sociology course would be about, the socialization process. So that definition that you see up there, that first bullet point, is that consistent with kind of the understanding that you came away with that sociology course about the socialization process? The process where we learn about our culture, the norms of behavior, the acceptable patterns of behavior, the traditions, the values of our society. Sounds good? Sounds pretty consistent? Right? Again, I want to be fair to my colleagues in sociology. Well, if we put the word political in front of it, it just changes it up to make it more narrow, right? So political socialization is the process in which each of us learns about our political culture. That is the political norms, the political traditions, the political values, and the acceptable patterns of political behavior. Through political socialization, people acquire attitudes and orientations towards the politics of their society. Okay, everybody got those definitions? As we, got to have basic definitions just for the sake of definitions are have only so much value, right? Really what I'm trying to make sure is that everybody's on the same page as we move forward with this discussion, so that when I use the word socialization or when I use the word political socialization, everybody understands what I'm talking about. The process where we learn about our culture or our political culture. We spent a little bit of time a couple of weeks ago before the freeze talking about the importance of ideology and political culture. One of the things that we said in that discussion was that Americans largely accept liberal values. Remember that? That despite all the differences among Americans in terms of race and ethnicity and income levels and educational levels of educational achievement, geography, etc., most Americans accept the basic values: liberty, equality, justice, rule of law. Does that ring a bell? Okay, so that raises an interesting question. Well, despite all that diversity in American society, how is it that Americans as I said previously, at least up until now, have by and large accepted those basic values of our culture, those fundamental values. And I think what some sociologists would point us to, political sociologists would point us to as well, that's the importance of the socialization process. Okay, so what we've said then is that in order for a political system to maintain itself, do its thing, so to speak, and convert those specific demands and expectations into public policy outputs, it has to have this diffuse support. It has to be able to generate and sustain that support if it's going to remain stable, as I said, over any indefinite period of time. Now, here's something that I want to focus on for just a few minutes, okay, that you don't really see in a lot of the literature. Again, I'm not a sociologist, so I don't read a whole lot of sociological literature, except as I run across it and it pertains to something very particular that I'm looking at the time. And I've never run across this distinction before, at least not in these terms. You might see those terms macro and micro. You might think, oh, that reflects Fagan's economics training. And I guess it probably does to some extent, right? I'm using the terms macro and micro here to make a very important distinction in terms of the way that the socialization process works, okay? So at a macro level, the socialization process is important because it usually teaches values and norms that support the system. These values. See, if the socialization process in the United States, any political society, but we're talking particularly about the American system, right? If it is successful in the United States, then not only the basic assumptions that we talked about early in our spirit of liberalism, but also the more specific values of liberalism, you would think would be held in common by most Americans. And as I said, I think certainly public opinion research seems to bear that out. I think maybe even the authors of your textbook make that point in a little bit different way, but I do seem to recall that they make the point that there's overwhelming support for the values of liberty and equality and democracy in the United States, okay? So that socialization at the macro level, at the systems-wide level, thus systems theory, right? The distinction between systems theory and hegemonic theory. Systems theory then would suggest a heavy emphasis on the socialization process at the systems-wide level. But there's another level at which this process occurs, and I think this is really where the authors of your textbook, and most textbooks in my experience, introductory government textbooks, focus their discussion of the socialization process, although they don't use this distinction. They don't make this distinction between either macro or micro or systems-wide and individual. They just kind of talk about the socialization process at the individual level. Just a quick show of hands, you're not going to be tested on it until a week from today, but who has read chapter 6 yet? Anybody read it yet? Anybody online? Nobody's read it yet. One person is admitting. Well, maybe you can confirm for your classmates that, number one, the authors of your textbook do have a discussion of the socialization process. It's not terribly long, but some discussion of the socialization process. And number two, they seem to focus on how it affects the attitudes of individuals. All right? So since you get enough of that from the authors of your textbook, yet another reason why I think it's important for me in class to focus on how the socialization process works at the systems level, at the systems-wide level. At the individual level or micro level, socialization is the process where each member of society comes to form his or her own specific set of political attitudes, values and beliefs, orientations and opinions. So while the socialization process has some basic similarities for all members of society, and that's why despite all of the diversity of American society, we pretty much all come away holding the same core values, liberty, equality, justice, etc. At the individual level, there can be variations for individuals or particular groups. And that's how we get differences, despite everything that we've said previously, a couple of weeks ago, and now in today's class session about Americans holding core values regardless of all this diversity in demographics, right? Despite that, we are a big enough society, we are a diverse enough society that you would expect that there would be some differences, okay? We can all believe in liberty, we can all believe in equality, we can all believe in justice and rule of law, and all those things that are so important to the American value system. And we can do that with some of us identifying ourselves as Democrats, some of us identifying ourselves as Republicans, and others identifying themselves as independents, or progressives, or conservatives, or moderates, right? In other words, it's at the individual level that we see the diversity of opinion that it manifests as a result of the socialization process. And again, the authors of the textbook, I think, as do most textbooks, really focus on socialization at that level, even though they don't point it out. All right, well, we talked about the primacy principle and the structuring principle, but I just want to remind you of one of the things that the primacy principle and the structuring principle imply. If you look down there at the very bottom, you've already seen those points above it, but if you look at that very last bullet point, it suggests that childhood, and even very early childhood, is critical in the process of successful political socialization. And that implies that the most important agent or agency of socialization, as the authors of your textbook say, is the parental family. Okay? So I want to move now to a discussion of the agents of socialization, the agencies of socialization. And I only have 3 on my list. Again, for the one person who's read chapter 6 already, and the rest of you are going to do that soon enough, you'll discover when you do that the authors of your textbook include these, but they also include other institutions in our society that perform this process of socialization, or that carry out this process. Do you remember, Natalie, do you remember at least one other agency of socialization that the authors of your textbook mentioned? If I give you one that they mentioned, maybe that'll stimulate you to think of another one. Mass media. Remember a discussion of mass media as an agency of socialization? Do you remember any others on your own? I don't mean to put you on the spot. I'm not trying to. It's enough that you've just, confirmed that you've read it, I suppose. But in addition to mass media, they talk about political parties, they talk about churches, they talk about a variety of other institutions in our society that perform this value transfer process. Okay? What I'm trying to tell you is that those are not on my list because those are more relevant to the socialization process at the micro level. Political parties, interest groups, mass media, etc. All those ones that the authors of your textbook mention in chapter 6 that are not on my list here, I'm going to tell you that those are important, but they're really more relevant to socialization at the micro level. And we want to focus on socialization at the macro level. Why? Because at the macro level, that's where this diffuse, if it's successful, socialization at the macro level produces this diffuse support that we've said is critical to the long-term maintenance and stability of the political system. So my list the family, parents, the parental family, schools in the educational system, and then finally peer groups. Now, as I said, I am not a sociologist. So what I'm reporting to you here is not my thoughts or my ideas, and I'm really trying to summarize to present to you some of the concepts that are introduced by our friends from sociology. In particular, there was a sociologist by the name of Dean Jaros. I used to, pre-pandemic circumstances, I might go up and write a name like that on the board, okay, just so that you can see it. Jaros, Dean Jaros, who wrote a book a number of years ago, a small little volume called Socialization to Politics. And much of what I'm going to say to you here is at least consistent with what Jaros is arguing in his book. Okay? So when it comes to the family, why do you think sociologists like Jaros would argue that the family is really the initial important agent of socialization? Based on what principle that you're already familiar with? Why would the family be the most important? And if this is so obvious, you think, well, there's really no point in saying it. I think sometimes it is important for us to state the obvious, okay? So as obvious as it may seem to you, why do you think Jaros would argue that the family is really the first and most important initial agent of socialization? But it goes to the primacy principle, right? The primacy principle says that the values that we learn earliest in life are really the key. And for most of us, the family is the institution that we're exposed to the most consistently and on a sustained basis in those early years. Right? Is very simple, straightforward, intuitive explanation for that. The parents are going to have the best opportunity to shape values because simply enough, that's who children are exposed to the most and the most consistently in those early years. Now, I made the distinction there again based on people like Jaros between two types of value transfer: direct value transfer and indirect value transfer. The distinction between direct and indirect is not the process is the same. Okay, the distinction is between the values themselves. So you have some values that have a direct political context, things like party identification and policy ideas. Did you pick up from the chapter 6, any information about the extent to which children tend to identify with the same political party as their parents? Do you remember reading anything about that? Again, I don't want to put you on the spot, but there's pretty good evidence, in fact, for a long period of time, that children, including fairly young children, tend to identify with the same political party or even the same candidates as their parents, providing some reason to believe that parents can successfully transfer the political value of party identification or candidate identification, right? How many of you remember when you were in elementary school participating in a mock election? There's a good picture here that kind of, any of you do this? Oh, they do it all the time in elementary schools, maybe not during pandemics, maybe not last fall in the 2020 cycle, but certainly before that. They love to do this kind of things with elementary kids. They're so cute, like they have their kids mark their ballots and then put them in the ballot box. And here's what I want to share with you, though. Believe it or not, there are some political scientists, sociologists, who actually study the results of mock presidential elections in elementary schools. And one of the things that they report to us is that they're actually a fairly good predictor of how the actual vote is going to turn out in the precinct that the elementary school is located in. Now, I wonder how that happens. Do you think, for example, that parents get a note, an email from their child's teacher, says, we're going to be having a mock presidential election in our class or in our school next week, blah, blah. And the parent then sits down the child and says, I got a note from your teacher. They're having an election. Listen, in this house, we're Republicans, and you will vote for whoever the Republican, Donald Trump, or whoever the Republican candidate is, or Democrat, right? We're Democrats in this house, right? Do you think that happens in very many families? I'm skeptical that it does. So how do you think that it is that there seems to be such a strong correlation between the votes of the children in the mock election and the votes of their parents in the precinct, in the actual election? If you are prone to committing the post-hoc fallacy, okay, have any of you taken a philosophy course and learned about post-hoc fallacy? Ergo propter hoc, as they like to use the Latin, but just in everyday language, post-hoc fallacy is the mistaken reasoning that we make when we conclude that event A caused event B simply because event A occurred prior in the order of time to event B. Does that make sense? So if we make that mistake in reasoning, and we know that the mock election occurred in the elementary school first, and then the actual voting in the precinct occurs after that, we might conclude that somehow the votes of the children are influencing the votes of the parents, or causing the votes of the parents. That doesn't seem to make much intuitive sense, does it? Your intuition tells you, you don't have to be a trained political scientist to understand that your intuition tells you that it's much more likely that somehow the parents are influencing the votes of their child. But if it doesn't occur as a matter of direct instruction, then somehow children are just picking that up, right? Just like children model other kinds of behavior. Do any of you have kids? You ever see your own behavior and your children's behavior and you shudder? Oh my goodness. what have I created, right? I am, so I can testify to that, right? If children model the behavior of their parents, and there's a lot of evidence that they do, okay, the chances that some of that may be political in nature doesn't seem so far-fetched, right? So the idea that they might pick up their parents' party identification just by watching their parents, just by observing their parents, or their preferences for these kind of candidates over these kind of candidates, again, is not terribly far-fetched. I think that's the basic argument that we're making here, however that specifically might occur. But again, to get back to the original point here, that value of party identification, or that value of, support for a particular candidate, is directly political in context. So that falls under this heading of direct value transfer. And I've indicated here policy ideals. I showed briefly passed by this picture a moment ago. Maybe some of you noticed it. I actually had a similar experience a number of years ago. I was in a Walmart. I generally try to stay out of the Walmart. But I had to go in one day for one item or something. And as I came through the door, trying to skillfully evade the greeter, do you all do that? I try to duck the greeter? I do. It's hard to be an introvert in life, right? I don't know if any of you are introverts, but sometimes the extroverts are constantly trying to pull you in. Sometimes I wish they would just, hey, leave me alone, right? Anyway, so I noticed as I kind of, detoured a little bit away from the greeter, my attention was caught by a young woman holding a small child, baby/toddler. What drew my attention initially was this kid had the most brilliant head of red hair I've ever seen in my life. And I'm Scotch-Irish. Just like this flaming ball of hair on the kid's head. I don't know if it was a boy or a girl, but as the woman turns, she's holding the child. I turn like in my direction. I can see that the child is wearing a t-shirt, and the t-shirt says, "Babies Against Abortion," which made me think a number of things, but I guess the most relevant to what we're talking about here is, I bet that child didn't select that shirt, but there's probably a pretty good chance that when this kid grows up, his or her attitudes on that issue are going to be pretty well defined. Wouldn't you think? What do you think this little girl's position might be on the issue of gun control? There is some effort by parents, right? If they're not sitting their children down and giving them direct instruction just through behavior to transfer specific political values to their children, there's some evidence that they're pretty successful at doing that. Okay? All right, so, let's get back on track here. With that in mind, values that have a direct political context, there's evidence that parents can play an important role there. But again, you know what the sociologists tell us is that it's really the indirect value transfer that is more critical to the long-term maintenance and stability of the political system. Here we're talking about values that don't have a direct political context, but that have implications for building loyalty and support for the system. So things like conformity, respect for authority figures, competition for rewards, moral, gender roles, moral values, etc. I'm not going to read the whole list to you. You can see it. Okay? To the extent that parents are successful in teaching the value of conformity. Let's just stay at the top of the list here, the first of the list. To what extent are parents successful in teaching their children conformity? Well, again, I'm not an expert in these kinds of things by any means, but speaking from personal experience as a parent, I would suggest to you that that's a big part of parenting. Teaching your children to conform to expectations and to, norms of behavior and so on. That's what it's all about to a large extent. And so different parents do it differently. Some parents do it through a system of rewards. Others do it through a system of punishments, perhaps, or some combination of the two. Right? But whichever way, it's teaching children to conform their behavior to expectations. Right? So how does that have any bearing whatsoever on building support and loyalty for the system? Well, the theory goes something like this. If parents can successfully teach their children to conform their behavior when they're young, as they grow up and they encounter other, notice the next one there says respect for authority figures, it works kind of the same way, right? As they encounter teachers and perhaps police officers and ultimately leadership, political leadership, right? That conformity will result in a willingness to obey the law at a minimum, right? A willingness to accept the norms of society, conform our behavior to the norms of society. Some of the sociological literature indicates that there may be some variation in the ordering of these values, not necessarily that they're going to be different values, but just in terms of how they're ordered and of importance on demographic basis, right? Race or ethnicity or socioeconomic class, etc. Okay. All right. So the family is number one. It has the best opportunity to shape values at an early age. Next are schools in the educational system. Okay. Most kids these days, in fact, for some time now, are going to school in some form or another, preschool, even before they get to the age of 5, right? So that provides even more opportunities for schools, the educational system, whether we're talking about pre-K or beginning at kindergarten, right? And again, you have this distinction here between direct value transfer and indirect value transfer. It means the same thing here as it does up here. It's about the values themselves. Are they directly political? So here, I've included things like curriculum content, although I've noted parenthetically that traditionally, curriculum content has emphasized idealized forms. The history lessons, for example, that we get, the American history lessons that we get in elementary school and in middle school and maybe even into high school tend to be, you know, well, there's a lot of mythology there, certainly. A lot of those lessons tend to be apocryphal, right? But there's certainly a lot of emphasis on heroic qualities of leadership, for example. Textbooks, another source for direct value transfer. How many of you are aware that the state of Texas is a pretty important in textbook adoption, questions about textbooks adoption, not only here in Texas, but nationally? I think there's a very simple economic reason for that. We have something on the order of 1,100 school districts in Texas. Right? Texas and California are really very important in this respect. So the publishing companies tend to bring what they have to offer to Texas and California. And then whatever Texas and California adopt tends to be what they offer elsewhere around the country, just from a economic standpoint, efficiency standpoint, right? Are you aware that the textbook adoption process, which occurs every so often in Texas, what is it? Does anybody know? Like once every 10 years they adopt new textbooks? I don't know what the cycle is, but let's just say for laughs, it's once every 10 years, right? When that happens, and it was not too long ago, too many years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, that we had a cycle come around, it's pretty controversial. Right? There's a lot of debate that gets generated. People from outside the state come in, or at least, through electronic means, kind of enter the debate about textbook adoption process. So the agency of the state of Texas that is responsible for textbook adoption, Texas Education Agency generally, but other sort of sub-agency levels that are responsible for textbook adoption, this is a very contentious process, very controversial and contentious process, not only in the social sciences, the history textbooks and the other kind of social science curriculum textbooks, but also in the natural sciences to a large degree, particularly biology. And the debate tends to be, it has, for the most part, been less about factual information and more about what information is going to be emphasized. Right? Several years ago, when this process came up, there was a big controversy, an effort on the part of the decision makers in Austin to remove references to Thomas Jefferson and deism from the history curriculum. The decision makers didn't think it was a good idea for our kids to hear about, I guess, about those aspects of American history. And of course, in recent years, new voices have been entertained. And, an effort, for example, on the part of leaders of the African American community and the Latino community to provide materials, curriculum materials that are not so Eurocentric, right? To provide greater emphasis on the contributions of African Americans and Latinos to American society and American culture. That generates a firestorm of debate in Austin when that process comes around every so often, okay? And the fact that there is this very contentious political debate over what is in textbooks should tell you that the debate is really about values. What values are going to be emphasized in the curriculum, right? All right, we mentioned last time the Pledge of Allegiance. That's clearly an effort to build loyalty for the system. Again, indirect value transfer. Notice some of the same ones that we see here. We also saw up here: conformity, respect for authority figures, competition for awards. Throw in democratic decision making. I think the public schools, elementary and secondary schools, are pretty big on that idea. All right. We mentioned the mock elections a moment ago, but also, you know, like electing class officers and so on. All right. Emphasis on citizenship. And again, there's some evidence in some of the sociological literature that these may vary according to the socioeconomic groups that are being served by a particular school or by the particular school system. Okay? People like Dean Jaros, I think, like to develop that argument that there is some evidence that there can be some differences, that the kinds of things that might be emphasized from this list or an expanded list that might be emphasized, for example, by schools, say in a middle to upper income school district in a large city in Texas, like the Houston area, or the Dallas-Fort Worth area, or something like that. There may be some noticeable differences between the kinds of values that are emphasized there versus maybe the values that are emphasized in a district down the Rio Grande Valley, or in El Paso County, or someplace like that. Okay, last on my list are peer groups. Give you a chance here to think about what we said while I quaff a quick drink. Questions about what we've said? All right, let's wrap this up. We only have a few more minutes. Last on my list are peer groups. The authors of your textbook have some discussion of the role of peer groups as well. Right? One of the things that we're trying to suggest to you by this list here is that the values that are taught here, as a general rule, there are always exceptions to general rules, right? Okay? But as a general rule, systems theory has argued that traditionally the values that are taught here are reinforced by the agents of socialization here. That there's a reinforcing by the schools in the educational system, there's a reinforcing of the values that are taught here. I think it's important to acknowledge those exceptions, though. As you can bet, there are people out there in the political debate that would take vigorous exception to the suggestion that schools in the educational system reinforce the values that are taught here. I would suggest to you, for example, and I could be wrong about this, I don't have any scientific evidence to present to you, but my intuition tells me that people who choose to educate their children at home do so primarily, not all of them, but many of them, primarily precisely because they believe that schools in the public school system, elementary and secondary schools, are not reinforcing the values that they teach to their kids, but in fact they are undermining the values that they teach to their kids. I think that's a big motivator for many home educators. particularly in places like Texas. So please understand that when I make these general observations of the sort that I just made, that systems theory argues that traditionally schools in the educational system reinforce the values that are taught by the family, I do want you to understand that there are some people who will vigorously argue that point. Okay, there are those voices out there. But in the same way, peer groups tend to reinforce the values that are taught here and here. Now, again, use your intuition here. Just use common sense. Why do you think that sociologists like Dean Jaros would argue that peer groups tend to reinforce the values that are taught initially by parents and secondarily by schools and the educational system? Is there a very straightforward explanation for that? Anybody?
Because parents teach the norms of society, and schools and the educational system should reinforce that.
Okay, but why does that mean that, Nate, why does that mean that peer groups would also tend to reinforce those values?
Because they were taught the same ones.
Okay, what's that, John?
Because when kids get to a certain age, of 7 or 8 and above, they start to get more influenced by what they make at school.
And who do they hang around with? Who are their peers? The people who are like them to begin with. Right? That's the very simple, straightforward. We tend to associate, our peers tend to be people who are very much like us. And if they're very much like us in outward ways, then they're probably going to be considerably like us in ways that aren't so outward, like the values that they hold. That's the very simple, straightforward explanation that Jaros would offer us. We tend to hang around with people who are like us in the first place. Now, there's an important caveat here, okay? Jaros and other sociologists, I think, are very quick to point out that of all the agents of socialization, traditionally, peer groups represent potentially the biggest challenge. Despite what I just said about reinforcing the values that are taught here and here, there's also this potential for peer groups to challenge the value systems that are taught here and here. And I suspect that's why parents worry so much about who their kids hang around with. Would you agree? That parents seem to have this intuitive understanding that all their hard work in teaching their kids right from wrong, teaching the kids the things that they ought to believe in, can be undone very quickly if their kids start associating with the wrong sort the parents might view as the wrong sort. So there is that potential for peer groups to challenge. And I think the sociological literature would suggest that that tends to occur at critical junctures in a person's life. One very important or critical juncture is adolescence. Okay? Adolescence is a period for most people where peer groups become very important, and the ability of peer groups to influence thinking maybe becomes more pronounced. But there are other critical junctions in a person's life as well as they go through life. Getting a new job, experiencing upward or downward social mobility, moving to a new part of the country, going off to college. In the old days when people used to go off to college, people do commuter colleges more now than anything else, right? But you can probably appreciate the point. Think about old Ludlow, who's been on the assembly line for his entire working life, who suddenly gets promoted to management and now has management peers. He's probably going to be in for a little value adjustment, and his old pals on the assembly line don't recognize him anymore. He's changed. Okay? So peer groups have that potential. Okay? Now the good news for parents is that the power of the primacy principle is pretty clear. So even if their children do go through a period of rebellion against the values that they taught them, the evidence is pretty strong that they tend to return to those values once they clear adolescence. for some people when they get into their 20s. Others, it takes a little bit longer. Maybe they get into their 30s. I know literally adolescence doesn't last that long, but maybe you've known people in their mid to late 20s or even their early to mid 30s that tend to act like adolescents. I certainly have. Right? Okay, so those are the two things I would suggest that you remember about peer groups. Generally speaking, they reinforce the values that are taught by parents in the school systems, and secondly, they do have that potential to challenge. Okay? All right, now, so having said all that, right, let me remind you what we're talking about here, just to wrap this up before the alarm goes off, okay? We're talking about these three agents of the socialization and not the others, because these are the three that are most relevant to the macro level of socialization. What's the macro level of socialization? Systems wide. If it's successful, what does it result in? It is a process whereby we learn about our culture, its values, etc. But if it's successful, what does it result in? A willingness on the part of most people to support the regime. Okay? So, you know, for those who argue that American society is going through a lot of upheaval in recent years, that those who worry about the culture wars, maybe people who are politically conservative more so, to worry about the culture wars, I suggest that the evidence, I mean, even though we've had some recent events that suggest some civil unrest, for the most part in our history, we've had a pretty stable go of it. We go through these periods, you know, where we do get a certain amount of tension and even like civil unrest, but for the most part, despite all of the diversity of American society, we have remained a relatively stable civil society. And that perhaps suggests that the socialization process at the macro level is still functioning in a way that's consistent with the way Jaros and other sociologists suggest that it's supposed to work. Okay? All right, we're out of time. We will see you next week.